Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar, Hurricane Fiona, Responding to Disasters in Island Settings. My name is Regine Webster, Executive Director at CDP, and currently serve as the Vice President. I like to believe that I bring a keen sense of adventure, discovery, and compassion to the fields of philanthropy and humanitarian assistance, helping to build bridges between those offering solutions and those in need. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Just a couple of reminders before we get started. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer those at the end of the panel presentation. If you're on Twitter, please use hashtag CDP4Recovery. That's CDP, the number 4, recovery, to share and join the discussion. And please don't forget to follow us on @FundsForDisaster. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. Please complete this to help improve our webinar offerings and to better meet your needs. And then finally, we are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. And we'll have live captioning available now via Zoom and also later on that recording. So all you have to do on Zoom right now is click on closed caption live transcript to access it. More accurate captions will be in the recording later. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, Hispanics in Philanthropy, the Funders Network, and United Philanthropy Forum. We are so thankful to all of you for your support. As we begin the webinar, CDP acknowledges that we're working from the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural disaster of colonialism, as well as disasters. We acknowledge when the US was founded that there were exclusions and erasures of indigenous knowledge about how to appropriately care for these lands, causing environmental destruction and degradation, which has had a significant impact on disaster risk in communities. We are committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy. We commit ourselves to understand where and how wealth accumulation has harmed people and the earth itself, and the complexities of philanthropy as connected to that truth. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, there is still and always will be indigenous land. Please join us and acknowledge the original peoples and their elders, past and present, as well as future generations. We've got a few goals today to guide our time. So at the end of the webinar, we hope that funders will have an overview of flooding and damage impacts from Hurricane Fiona. They will understand how to best support community organizations working on the ground and learn about the unique needs of disaster response in island communities. Now, in terms of an overview, this is a rapidly changing event. And in fact, Hurricane Fiona is not even over. As Fiona wanders up the Atlantic coast to Canada, we are continuing to watch and monitor. However, given the significant impacts that we've already seen, especially in Puerto Rico, we want to make sure that funders have the opportunity to learn about needs and gaps to begin planning their response and recovery efforts. Now, it's my honor to introduce our special guests. I'm looking forward to the information that they will share with us. Laura Lima is the Associate Director of Donor Engagement at Hispanics in Philanthropy, HIP. Laura works with a diverse network of funders to center and advance HIP's programmatic priorities to elevate equity, influence, and leadership for Latinx and Latin Americans across the Americas. Charlotte Gossett Navarro is the Puerto Rico Chief Director at the Hispanic Federation. She has 20+ years of experience as a solutions-oriented coalition builder, advocate, educator, and nonprofit leader working to eradicate structural inequalities in the United States and Puerto Rico. She's been leading the Hispanic Federation's efforts in Puerto Rico since 2017. Welcome to each of you, and thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us. Charlotte, let's start with you. But first, you live in Puerto Rico, and I'm really glad you're safe. But can you tell me what you're seeing in your own community and neighborhood? Do you have power or water? What are you seeing on the ground? And what are you seeing as the most immediate need?
Hi, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm here in San Juan right now, the main metro area of the capital of Puerto Rico. And fortunately, although we were certainly impacted by the hurricane, San Juan has fared better than other areas. The community that I live in, we lost, we were part of the big blackout that lost power, lost water. It is slowly beginning to come back, but even in a neighborhood like mine, you have buildings that are next to each other, such as my building, where we got electricity back fairly quickly, but the building right next door is still on a generator and still without water. So even within the same neighborhood, we're seeing kind of an inequitable recovery there. But across all of Puerto Rico, we still are only 38% of all of Puerto Rico that has electricity and 67% water access. And so we are still very much kind of in the crisis mode for the vast majority of Puerto Rico. And we're seeing that as we speak with our network of nonprofits. We've been in contact with them over the last 5 years. We built up a network of about 140 nonprofit organizations that are based here in Puerto Rico and are all still very much in crisis mode of responding to the immediate needs of communities, especially because of that lack of electricity and water, as well as the flooding that many communities faced.
Yeah, there's certainly been a lot to read and digest as it relates to electricity and water. It's a lot to take in and to understand for sure. And as you put it, you're right in the thick of it. So thank you for helping us understand. Laura, I want to ask you a similar question. HIPS grantees and partners are spread across many of the affected communities. What are you hearing from them about the needs and issues on the ground?
Hi, everyone. Thank you as well. HIP is pleased to be part of this conversation. I echo a lot of what Charlotte has already shared, and it's amazing to share space with Charlotte and the amazing work that she's doing in Puerto Rico. As she mentioned, the storm is still happening. It's still going strong. So I think our partners are still waiting for it to pass to truly evaluate what the damage is. And in the meantime, responding to some of the direct service needs that Charlotte was mentioning, like the flooding and the power. I think this time around, with this hurricane, there are resources and supplies on the island, which was a bit different than what we saw after Maria. And so there is a need for cash assistance and mutual aid on the ground while folks are trying to evaluate sort of the long-term damage once the storms pass and the flooding passes as well. So I'll probably just share that bit. I think Charlotte has really explained it the best.
Charlotte, let's go back to you. You've been leading the Hispanic Federation's response in Puerto Rico for 5 years. 5 years. I'm curious, what kinds of gaps have you seen in recovery in that time between Hurricanes Maria and now Hurricane Fiona?
Yeah, I think probably one of the biggest gaps that I would point out are electricity. Certainly, I mean, we're living that right now. It's been something we've been advocating for a while, is how slowly the recovery process has been for the electricity grid, as well as, from our perspective, some mistakes in how they're prioritizing the federal funding that's coming in. We really want to see that funding used for distributed or decentralized rooftop solar energy projects. All of the research studies show that is what's going to make Puerto Rico more resilient and ready for the future. And although the government has allocated some of the funding for those type of projects, it hasn't really made the type of commitment to ensure that Puerto Rico reaches its public policy goal of 100% renewable energy by 2050. And right now, it's been interesting because we are able to see in this moment, as there is power outages across Puerto Rico, some of the good things that we have seen are that where we have invested in solar energy, you're seeing the difference, right? The federally qualified health centers, for example, after Hurricane Maria, were not able to get up and operate quickly. They were struggling, they were closed, and we saw impacts on healthcare. We made, with partners of ours ours. We made big investments in renewable energy for many of those federally qualified health centers, and we've been able to reach them and find out that they did not have to stop their operations at any moment during Fiona. Even right now, they have had consistent electricity all throughout. We made investments in some community-led projects for flooding mitigation, and we're hearing back from those communities that they did not flood this time. And so we're seeing that mitigation, and particularly around energy, but also the type of flooding mitigation projects, community scale, that we've been asking the government to invest in. They are working at the community level where we've been able to invest in them, but I'm speaking in Spanish, lentitud, how slow those recovery dollars first, they were delayed, unfortunately, I think because of political reasons from our previous administration. And now that they've reached here, it's a question of the capacity to spend that amount of money down quickly. I think the other gap that, for us, and given this is a philanthropy call, one of the things we were concerned about when we first arrived, which is why Hispanic Federation made the decision to stay in Puerto Rico, is that there has long been underinvestment in Puerto Rico, and there was not a very large local philanthropic sector, and unfortunately not a lot of attention from the national philanthropic sector. And so one of the concerns we had that we have seen happen is that although there was quite a lot of support immediately after Hurricane Maria, with each disaster that's come after, and with the longer term recovery, unfortunately, there wasn't a big shift in the national philanthropic sector to include Puerto Rico as part of their ongoing geographic support areas. And so I think that's something that we see as needed, because unfortunately, despite all of the public funding that is coming to Puerto Rico, we need the philanthropic support for the organizations for both things like matching funds, but also to do projects in communities that are being left out of that government response. But again, I think we have seen positive success. We've seen a much more organized nonprofit sector this time around, able to respond, able to use, for example, the community kitchens that are being mobilized right now for this response, and that we're moving resources to. Almost all of those community kitchens have been lifted up with philanthropic funding in these last 5 years. And so we're seeing that those investments are making a difference this time around, despite the fact that we are still struggling in this moment.
I completely appreciate the sentiment of la lentitud, right? Like the slow pace at which the investment comes in. Laura, excuse me, leading off of that, the hurricane hit Puerto Rico almost 5 years to the day after Hurricane Maria. What have we learned from recovery about Maria that funders should be sure to do this time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I want to continue to underline some of the funding challenges that Charlotte has already raised. HIP has supported Puerto Rico through Hurricane Irma, Maria, the earthquakes, and the pandemic, through emergency relief, but also some longer term funding around recovery and rebuilding. And I think HIP has been sort of a resource to funders who cannot or have chosen not to fund in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. But since Maria, for 5 years, we've really been trying to encourage and lift up and ask funders to fund Puerto Rico directly, develop those relationships with the local organizations that are in Puerto Rico, fund directly to them, do what you have to do internally to change those dynamics so that you can step away from, whatever the challenges or the barriers are that are not allowing your institution to fund to Puerto Rico. This way, what we see this time around is that the foundations or the organizations that decide to fund and to commit to funding in Puerto Rico 5 years later, when we are still having these storms and these reasons that we need to support quickly, those that have had relationships can move the money quicker and faster and have built that infrastructure to be able to do that. And so what we see is, it seems like the island is continuously trying to recover from the previous storm and the previous storm. And in order to really create like an ongoing movement to include long-term systemic planning and organizing, that has to include a long-term commitment and long-term funding. So I think that's one of the good things that has come over the last 5 years is some of that infrastructure, some of those relationships, so that we can move money quicker. Funders that don't fund in Puerto Rico know now sort of where to go and where they can put their money to get it to on the ground. But the truth is that we really need more of this long-term movement building support. We know now what organizations are on the ground ready to act quickly when there is a storm, when there is something that impacts the island. So we need to continue to get the funding there. And as Charlotte was saying, let's not just pull out once we think it's over, because the rebuilding is not over and the island continues to be impacted when there is a new storm.
Laura, let's stay with you for another question. But before I ask you your question, I just want to make sure that everybody who is participating in today's webinar, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A chat box. We will make sure to incorporate all of those questions in with Laura and Charlotte's expertise. So, oh, I just saw a question pop up. Super, keep them coming. Okay, back to you, Laura. Given your background with the Environmental Grantmakers Association, what can you tell us about the impact of a disaster in an island setting and how it's different from other disaster recovery efforts?
Yes, so for folks that are unaware, I was with the Environmental Grantmakers Association prior to Hispanics in Philanthropy. Actually, we co-hosted a conference before the pandemic in Puerto Rico to bring more attention to the issues in Puerto Rico and to get funders to fund on the island. So some of the things that we saw and that we learned, I mean, I think to start off with the physical distance between the mainland and the island, I think there is a lack of attention and interest to the island, to the infrastructure, to the systemic needs that are in the island. I mean, even with, the Hurricane Fiona, we saw probably more people paying attention to the death of the Queen than the impacts of Fiona. So that's something that I think that's work that we need to do internally on the mainland to continue to bring attention around these issues year round and all the time, and not just when there is an instance like a storm. Also, as I mentioned before, the funding challenge. I think a lot of foundations select to not fund in Puerto Rico or in the Caribbean. And so there's a need for intermediaries like HIP then to create these funds, to allow funds to pass through and to be able to support the island quickly and efficiently. But I think that we have to sort of get past that idea that it's an island, that it's remote, that it's away. I mean, it's part of the United States, and I think we should react with our funding and with our philanthropic models in the same way. And I think the last thing that I will add is that, we're starting to see increased displacement from Puerto Rico. The good thing of the aftermath of Maria is what we were mentioning earlier. We've created networks of people and phone trees to be able to communicate and respond quickly. But after Maria, we also saw a significant number of people leave the island. Folks, I think, are frustrated and, with the freaking storms and mostly the lack of human response. So the number of displaced people, I think, will continue to increase. This, creates gaps on the island for folks to come in and take advantage of that. And also, I think our local communities in the mainland and in other parts of the globe, we're not building a welcoming community fast enough and to provide the resources from the folks that are, choosing to leave the island. So now there's a bigger question of how do we respond? And I think that's really an urgent question. I think it's something that we have to talk about, strategize with each other as funders, because it's happening. And so, we can't not have a strategy for displaced folks that choose to leave, and we can't not fund the island. So there has to be a change here.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I remember when the Center for Disaster Philanthropy was working in Puerto Rico as a grant maker around the time of Hurricane Maria. I remember learning about the implications of being a territory in disaster recovery instead of being a state in disaster recovery, and the marginalization that occurs because of that. And it was very sobering to learn that. Charlotte, let me turn now to you, please. After Dorian and other disasters that hit islands, we've seen waste and debris management be one of the biggest physical demands. But there are also social and cultural issues related to being on an island. What have you seen in your work in Puerto Rico that might be different on the US mainland or elsewhere?
Sure. And I think you both you and Laura just touched on some of those differences. So maybe I'll focus the answer a little bit on some of the technical differences that there are in Puerto Rico and that we've noticed that have created challenges both for communities and organizations to access philanthropic funding, but also public funding. And one of those is the scale of the way that groups operate in Puerto Rico. I think we have found both government and philanthropy are often looking for one big organization who can respond to the entire island, and or when they look for subcontractors in Puerto Rico, they look for one big group, and when they don't find them, often then looking to groups in the US to come. And so I think one thing that's important to understand is the scale. We have a lot, it's a very diverse, it's a small location, but very diverse geography, very diverse needs in each of the regions of Puerto Rico. And so the scale of what is considered a big nonprofit here in Puerto Rico maybe look very different than that scale in the United States, is similarly to businesses. And that's made it difficult for some groups to respond, and sometimes requires, instead of one grants to multiple groups, or working with intermediaries, such as Laura mentioned. In addition to that, we have had nonprofit groups face difficulties around some of the legal structures. So for example, in Puerto Rico, especially after Maria, a lot of organizations didn't have a 501c3, which made it difficult for some funders who required that to be able to support them. Puerto Rico has its own nonprofit legal structure in addition to the 501c3. And so many nonprofits have that is provided by the State Department here in Puerto Rico, but it wasn't accepted by many philanthropic groups, and they weren't able to have that flexibility. Those legal structures also made it very difficult after Maria and after the earthquakes for people to get access to FEMA funding. And we're trying to make sure that doesn't happen again this time around, because most of Puerto Rico doesn't have a title to their homes and to land. Often they were then denied FEMA funding, even though technically the laws don't require it, FEMA was requiring it. And so I think there's been quite a bit of advocacy over the last few years to both educate FEMA and make sure that they know their own rules and that they are not applying unnecessary restrictions, and the government of Puerto Rico as well, around requiring titles, when the law in Puerto Rico, the government does not require homeowners to have titles. And then language access has been a major challenge, both applying for funding from US foundations, but also applying for funding from the government is required in English, and Spanish is the first language here in Puerto Rico. And although many people do speak English or can manage in English, really when it comes to applying for or completing some of these complicated applications and doing them in a second language is either difficult or impossible for some groups to be able to do well and access that support. And then you had mentioned, I think, some of the other challenges that are related to the colonial relationship or the territory status of Puerto Rico between Puerto Rico and the United States, and our lack of equity between the type of resources that a state may have access to, or individuals living in the states may have access to, versus individuals here in Puerto Rico. There are basic programs that are supposed to attend to the lowest income and most vulnerable people that residents here cannot access, such as supplemental Social Security or SSI. A person living with disabilities in Puerto Rico or the elderly who are low income do not have access to SSI. Our SNAP program does not exist. We have a program called NAP. So when it comes to nutrition after a disaster like this, unless Congress allocates additional funding for Puerto Rico, what they end up having to do is divide the same size pie amongst a lot more people who are suddenly in need. And so food security becomes a major issue, and we have to spend a lot of time advocating to Congress to allocate those additional funds and then to sustain those funds across that time period. And then other challenges such as our system of healthcare here in Puerto Rico is currently in crisis. We have very few doctors and specialists remaining in Puerto Rico. So again, if you're responding to health needs right now, we are challenged. And I say that because Puerto Rico does have double the poverty rate of the poorest state within the United States. And in a recent study on inequity of all of the cities in the US, San Juan actually came in the San Juan metro area as the highest inequity of any place within the United States. And so that's kind of the structures that we're dealing with as we go into trying to recover from disasters, not just Fiona, not just Maria, but the earthquakes, the pandemic, and the economic disaster that Puerto Rico was in even before Maria hit. And so it's on top of all of that that we're trying to build a recovery response.
Charlotte, I want to add to that. My colleague let me know that in Puerto Rico, 1 in 5 people have a disability and they too are not able to access SSI. So your remarks on SSI were again, I hate to use this word twice in 1 hour, but really, it's really sobering. It's really sobering and distressing.
Agree. Yeah. Agree. And it's something that at this point needs to be resolved by Congress. There was recently a Supreme Court case around SSI trying to show that this was discrimination against residents in Puerto Rico. It was called Valle Madero, but unfortunately the Supreme Court found in favor of the United States government and in their authority to discriminate against residents in SSI and other federal benefit programs, these safety net programs. So at this point now it's up to Congress to address these inequities.
Oh, that is really disheartening, Charlotte. Oh, okay. I'm going to do kind of a hard turn and talk about the Atlantic hurricane season. And a question for both Laura and Charlotte is this, if I'm doing my math correctly, we still have 2.5 months remaining of the Atlantic hurricane season, all of October and November. How would you encourage the private philanthropic community, right, and corporations, how would you encourage them to think about addressing these now existing needs from Hurricane Fiona, while at the same time, maintaining reserves or planning effectively for the next 10 weeks in what we still know is going to be a very busy hurricane season over those 70 days. So how do you prioritize that? How do you counsel people to think about that?
Well, I mean, I don't know that I have a clear answer for that. It's something we also go through as both a nonprofit and a funder, is how are we utilizing for immediate need, how are we utilizing for long-term and the in-between. Unfortunately, with the realities of climate change, not just here in Puerto Rico, although here in the Caribbean, I think we're faring pretty, we're faring worse than many locations in terms of how many hurricanes and climate disasters we can expect now and in the future, but of course they are becoming more frequent. And so I think that goes back to the point that I made earlier around where were the gaps in recovery and looking at projects that are really around mitigation as well, and projects that really set communities up so that the impact of these disasters each time can be hopefully lessened, and that communities have more resiliency. It's an overused word, but I think it it is true. Again, as we shared with the solar energy or these projects around flooding, looking at those not just investments for these immediate short-term crises, but longer term investments. And also I would add looking at investments in advocacy and policy work for organizations here in Puerto Rico who do that sort of work, and in the US to address those inequities and to address the challenges that have really created Puerto Rico to be a place that is not ready to face all of these disasters, and to make sure the funding that is arriving goes where it needs. And there is definitely a gap in funding of policy and advocacy and community organizing here in Puerto Rico.
Laura, what are your thoughts to add to Charlotte's on how to prioritize across the entire hurricane?
Yeah, so Hispanics in Philanthropy has currently launched 2 funds, and I can't seem to put them in the chat, but we can follow up with them we can share them with the recording later. But These are accessible to anybody, donors, institutions, and so on. One fund, we are working actually with Hispanic Federation and with the Community Foundation of Puerto Rico and the Fiona Community Response, and also Dominican Republic based organizations. So this fund will help provide immediate relief to the organizations there. And I think what's really important here is we're also including the Dominican Republic, which we haven't talked about much on this call, but is also getting severely impacted. So that's one fund. The other fund is called the Fiona Community Response Fund, and it's powered by the Maria Fund in partnership with 25 organizations on the ground. So these are two sort of like immediate places that you can go to provide some funding. And then to my previous points from earlier, it's building relationships with organizations, like talk to Charlotte, talk to myself. Let's connect, let's strategize together. How can we support the organizations on the ground to rebuild? How can we work together to address climate impact? How can we work together to support people on the move that are displaced? So I think there are short, medium, and long-term things that philanthropy and institutions can do. So I think, as Charlotte said, it's not one organization. I think we all really have to work together and figure out what are the organizations, who are they, how do we build relationships, how do we fund long-term, and don't look away. Like, let's remember that we have to be in this for the long term. That would be, I think, my biggest message.
And if I can jump into the list of groups, of course, Hispanic Federation is also has a recovery fund, but I also want to mention there is a local philanthropy serving organization as well here, Filantropía Puerto Rico, who are often looking for philanthropic organizations from national and international groups to join, to participate. They have an upcoming conference in October, and they are trying to also coordinate some of this philanthropic response and help guide philanthropic organizations and where they can invest here in Puerto Rico and how to align their efforts with local funders here on the ground.
Such a comprehensive answer. Thank you so much, and thanks for sharing those resources. I do have one other question for the two of you. What's the overall takeaway message for funders on our call today, and how can they best support affected people and communities? Laura, do you want to start?
Yeah, I feel like I've just been repeating myself, but I just really encourage funders to give, like fund in the Caribbean. It's just something, this has been the message 5 years ago. It's going to be the message in 5 years in the future. I mean, the climate impacts, we are seeing them more and more every day, and they are disproportionately impacting folks in the Caribbean and women and children and people of color and low. So it's just, we have to strategize together. We have to convene with Filantropía Puerto Rico. We have to convene with Hispanic Federation. We have to talk to each other and collaborate, and we have to support the organizations that are there after the flooding goes down and the flooding disappears, the ones that are organizing, the ones that are mobilizing, the ones that are marching, the ones that are protesting, the ones that are really trying to get the government to respond quicker, faster, to get more money, to update the infrastructure, to support the solar projects that Charlotte has been talking about. This just has to be a long-term movement effort with urgency, so that we're not repeating ourselves, every 5 years. I think that's I just can't emphasize that enough.
And I think Laura summed it up pretty well. And again, at the risk of repeating, long-term recovery as well after the immediate support that is there to make long-term commitments to these recovery projects, to infrastructure projects that are going to help prepare communities for future disasters, but also, again, to think about systemic change by supporting advocacy and policy work at the community level to really try to address some of the root causes of the reasons we are experiencing this.
How we got here and where are we going, right, Charlotte? Well, we've got several questions, some that came from the audience in advance of our call, and then we have 9 open questions here. So let's just dive into some of these audience questions. So Antoine from Build Change asks this: if there is a mobilization effort occurring in Florida in support of Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, how can we learn more about those efforts or the implementing organizations leading those efforts? Do either of you want to jump in on that one?
And I missed the first part you were saying. Was there community? I missed the first half of the question.
The question is if there's any mobilization effort occurring in Florida in support of Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. So is there anything happening in Florida that could be of help to the affected region?
Sure. So I know, for example, at least our office in Florida, we have an office in Orlando that was very active after Hurricane Maria and supporting people who had been displaced, both temporarily and people who had decided to relocate to Florida. They are again active in looking at how to support the community, keep them oriented, and waiting to see if, again, this causes a major wave of displacement. At the moment, we have not seen a major wave as we saw after Hurricane Maria. But certainly I expect that over time there will continue to be folks moving from Puerto Rico to Florida. And so if there are groups who want to connect with that office in Florida, they certainly can, because they are organizing there, and they are very connected to the communities there in the diaspora communities in Central Florida.
Okay. Anything to add, Laura?
I think the short answer is yes. I'm sure there are also organizations in Florida mobilizing around this work. We are doing some work in Florida and the south of the U.S. with our Power Building and Justice Fund. So I'm happy to put my information in the chat if folks want to connect on specifically this question. I can connect you to some of our partners there, but also if you want to connect more widely, I'm available.
That's great. Okay, we're turning now to the questions that are in the Q&A. Nurali Desai has asked, what are the most impacted regions, municipios in Puerto Rico? Charlotte, do you want to do that one?
Sure. And what I will start with is by saying, don't look at the current FEMA map of the declaration of emergency, because there's currently quite a bit of advocacy to amend it because it left out municipalities that were severely impacted. The communities that I would say, and the regions that really have had it the worst, one in sort of the northeast would be Toa Baja. Toa Baja faced quite a lot of flooding as a result of the river there that overflowed. Loíza as well, when the dams were opened up, Loíza faced a lot of flooding in their community. And then the southern coast of Puerto Rico and the communities in the southern coast, particularly Salinas, faced major flooding, but we are hearing that many of the rural parts of the south and center of Puerto Rico also were dramatically impacted. We know we've been in Utuado, Orocovis and Morovis are mostly still cut off because of road landslides that caused roads to collapse, and so there's quite a bit of challenge in accessing those municipalities. Utuado as well, where we were today, but because of electricity also, again, it depends how we talk about community. That's sort of the regional communities, and then population wise, we are always concerned about people who have precarious health, because each time the power goes out, even when it is not in the middle of a hurricane, we know that people who depend on that electricity for life-saving devices are put at risk. And that's something we've been hearing constantly throughout this, is the community of people, particularly with diabetes, for example, or who depend on respirators, are struggling right now to make sure that they can find the electricity needed to sustain those devices. And so as a population, a community population, also one of the most impacted.
sorry, I was muted. I just asked you, Charlotte, if you wanted to put any more information out there about the advocacy around the FEMA map, any more information to share there.
Sure. I'm going to share some links from one of our partner organizations, Ayuda Legal, who's been kind of leading that effort here. They're a fantastic nonprofit legal service advocacy organization here in Puerto Rico and work quite a bit on housing. I'm sure anyone who's been funding in Puerto Rico has probably heard of them, and I'll drop some links on what they have been doing already to try to address that. But the government of Puerto Rico is also trying to address it as well.
That's terrific. Thank you. Turning now to a question from Jennifer Pelton. Jennifer says, appreciating the comments about philanthropy for the long haul, please share any information about supporting mental health and mitigating trauma of repeated climate challenges. Laura, is that something you would have wisdom on?
Sure. And for this question, I mean, because we're talking about Puerto Rico, I will answer it focused on Puerto Rico, but that could also be a broader question around mental health and trauma support from climate impacts nationally, globally, and so on. So in terms of Puerto Rico, I want to add in the chat a bit more information around the Fiona Community Response Fund. Here you can see the local organizations that are part of this fund. And I'm sure many of them are working on some of the, these concerns around mental health post the impacts of the storms that have occurred in Puerto Rico. After Maria, we saw that the community came together in a really beautiful way, either through arts or through music or through dance. There was a local dance studio in Puerto Rico that let people come in and just use their their sink that was working with running water so they can brush their teeth, and then they would host like dance, and they would just dance together, and that was a way of relief. So I think some of it is informal in Puerto Rico in terms of how do you respond to the stress and the frustration of the impacts of the storms, and then some of it is a bit more formal. But I wanted to share this, share more information about these organizations because they might have more formal support to this question.
Charlotte, I think that this next question is for you. It comes to us live from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, what tips would you give similar communities in other places going through a major disaster in terms of getting attention, increased funding, rebuilding, etc.? And it says, I'm thinking specifically of rural Western Alaska, where a typhoon hit over the weekend and wiped out many communities and villages, or largely Alaska Native.
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge because as we mentioned, with so many disasters happening, the media attention, which is often one of the things that is helpful, can switch so quickly to the next challenge, and that's the reality of the world that we are living in now. I think spaces like this have been very helpful in spaces where there are philanthropy groups brought together to be able to hear about what is happening in a particular region and what their needs are, has certainly supported that work. And trying to get a presence in Washington, D.C. Hispanic Federation has a large presence. We have an office in Washington, D.C., but it's working with those national partners to make sure that Puerto Rico is included in other advocacy. So, when we see someone doing advocacy on any general topic of equity or social justice, often we have to make sure that they add Puerto Rico to that. So a lot of it is advocacy within the advocacy community or within the nonprofit community to say, please include Puerto Rico in that. If you're talking about, child tax credit, for example, which is a good example that was recently extended to Puerto Rico, and before we didn't have the full access to it, a lot of that was educating national organizations who do advocacy on these topics about the needs of Puerto Rico as well, and the inequities in Puerto Rico. And so it did take a lot of education on that, similarly with environmental and solar groups, to educate them around what does environment and solar look like in Puerto Rico. And so when you're doing advocacy around what needs to happen in the US on solar, note that it may look a little bit different in Puerto Rico. And so I think that has been part of what's been effective for us has been that sort of constant voice there saying, don't forget Puerto Rico, include Puerto Rico in this, make sure that Puerto Rico isn't accidentally written out, which has happened on many occasions, and really doing a lot of that with those national groups who are well known on many of these topics, but may not be as familiar with Puerto Rico. And I can imagine the same thing for communities in Alaska and indigenous communities in Alaska. There's often a lack of awareness about what are the real challenges there. And so finding those allies in these organizations and helping them build their expertise on the unique needs of our communities has really helped make sure that Puerto Rico gets amplified in other spaces.
This question flows actually really nicely also from an anonymous attendee. And it's this: with Hurricane Maria and other disasters historically, there have been issues, both episodic and chronic, with mismanaged funding on the island and reports of corruption problems and such. What has changed to help support efforts to ensure funding goes to intended recipients, and how can we reassure donors with concrete steps that have been taken to assist in those efforts in rebuilding trust that may have been lost? Laura, what do you think about that?
I think this is, the reason why we encourage direct relationships is so that you can fund to the give to the organizations. I don't know if I have much to add besides that, but if you have relationships with Hispanic Federation, with the organizations that are on the ground, you hear directly from them, what do they need? What is it that they are working towards? What is it that they want to achieve? What are their needs? And so having those conversations and having those relationships is how you are going to, sort of be certain of where your funding is going. And I hope that will also create more honest and genuine relationships and conversations with those from the ground and those that are in Puerto Rico and are seeing the issue evolve every day. I think I'll just leave it there.
And
I like where you left it, Laura. Thank you. Yeah, chime in, Charlotte.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think when corruption is a real problem here in Puerto Rico, I mean, we've been in the news for it, but I also feel that Puerto Rico has been a bit unfairly maligned, as though corruption is a problem that exists here greater than it does in other locations or in other states. And we know if we look at the news, you can look at many other states and find that unfortunately elected officials and others have found ways to misuse funding that is going to them and fail their communities. And so, yes, I think it is a real issue here, but I don't know that it is to the level that unfortunately some of the national narrative has really focused on that and called Puerto Rico out on. But we do, we do know it's a problem. And as Laura mentions, for us, the role there is civil society. A lot of the work here has been to look at how to integrate civil society as part of the accountability mechanisms and as part of those decision makers and how funding are being used, and trying to create greater mechanisms for transparency and participation throughout the entire recovery process. And there are groups that have been very effective on this. This has been one of our number one advocacy issues here in Puerto Rico, and trying to create those structures within the recovery process for that transparency. And then there are nonprofit organizations who are specifically trying to work on that. I can think of Sembrando Sentido, for example, who is a new organization that came after Hurricane Maria, whose entire focus is corruption. And right now they're looking at corruption and developing platforms and using innovative technology and ways to create that transparency and contracting processes and really educate around corruption, because some of the corruption has to do, unfortunately, with people with bad intentions, but sometimes the corruption is for the lack of mechanisms around accountability and lack of capacity within the government to do their own sort of accountability process or fiscal processes within there. And so they are working to try to address some of those structural issues and to create those mechanisms as well. So I would add that, and to, when it comes to funding, it is funding to support that participation and that civic engagement, not just in the voting idea of civic engagements, but civic engagement in the way of participation throughout this process for organizations to be on top of how money is being spent. Another nonprofit, just to throw another name in, the Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, or they are a investigative journalistic organization that created an entire platform as well around transparency around how funding was being used, and to make sure that they can identify those funds and create public access to look for, to know exactly where funds are being used.
You know, you've touched on this a bit, but Charlotte, I'm going to ask you to speak to this, and then Laura, please. Are there other issues that arise because Puerto Rico is a territory? And I'll tie this into this other question here, which is that many folks on the mainland don't know that PR is a U.S. territory. And so what should mainlanders do to help, quote unquote, change the narrative to highlight how the situation is ongoing? And Charlotte, one thing I'll ask you to speak to, if you don't mind me planting a seed with you, is when you spoke about Congress needing to make decision about SSI, could you speak to what Puerto Rico's voting power is in Congress?
Sure, and I can start with that. Right now, for Puerto Rico, we have one non-voting representative. This is true for many of the territories. One non-voting representative in Congress, who is, again, can voice her opinion, but cannot vote on any of the issues. That one member does not change based on our population. If representation was based on population, we would have more representatives. We actually have a larger population than, I believe, 12 US states here in Puerto Rico. And then when it comes to voting in national elections, Puerto Rico is able to vote in presidential primaries, but not able to vote in presidential elections to elect the president. I think that, that is because of the territory status or the colonial status. Again, the same can be said for other territories who probably have some of them have even more visibility issues than Puerto Rico does, because they are smaller populations or even further away. We are the largest territory, but certainly not the only one treated inequitably. And so that is one of those big challenges. I mentioned some of the other structural differences before in terms of our language, in terms of nonprofit status, and some of the legal structures that we have, and not having access to some federal government resources that are made available. So I won't go into depth on that again, but certainly when it comes to representation in government, we do not have the same representation in government as others, which is really a question of how does Puerto Rico go through their own self-determination process to determine how and what relationship they want to have through the US, and that has not been facilitated yet.
Laura, I'd love to have you talk. There's a couple of questions here that speak to solar or wind energy and the vulnerability of the grid. Can you speak to what the biggest barriers are now in Puerto Rico in rebuilding energy projects, and then also if there are NGOs that you know specifically that are supporting that?
Yeah, I actually might turn this question to Charlotte. At Hispanics in Philanthropy, we are less focused on the solar and energy grid conversation, as I was at the Environmental Grantmakers Association. Okay. At HIP, we're supporting more of the organizers, the direct and system change work. So I'm happy to talk a bit more about that. But Charlotte, I think you brought this up a little bit earlier, so you might have more information on what is going on currently.
Sure. So Puerto Rico has received, well, I'll start with in 2019, Puerto Rico received or passed a law to be 100% renewable energy by 2050. That's the current public policy here in Puerto Rico. And alongside all of that, there have been ample studies to show that decentralized rooftop solar energy is the best solution for Puerto Rico to reach that goal and to do so in a resilient way. in a way where right now part of our challenges with the energy grid is how centralized the grid is. Most of the energy is produced in the south and then sent, and it's fossil fuel based energy that's then sent along long transmission grids all across Puerto Rico. So it doesn't take much as we're living right now to knock the system out. Even before Fiona, we were having constant power outages and major protests in Puerto Rico in the weeks leading up to Hurricane Fiona around our electricity system or our grid and its failures. Failures both in terms of infrastructure, but in terms of administration as well. Puerto Rico entered into a controversial public-private partnership with an administrator called Luma Energy. And unfortunately, since they have begun administering the grid, we have actually seen an increase in power outages instead of the promised improvement on the system. And so, there have been, again, there were pretty regular protests happening, questioning the contract with Luma Energy, questioning the need or really advocating for the need to transition to renewable energy. Right now, we have a big challenge with political will. We have the funding, the recovery money. President Trump, unfortunately, had held up the money that was allocated for our electricity grid for a while. It was released, though. So that money, now we have the money to do the grid. The question is, how is the government of Puerto Rico going to prioritize rooftop solar energy projects and a decentralized system to make sure that we meet that energy goal, and again, that we do it in a decentralized way? They've promised some of that money for solar energy projects through CDBG funding, through their plans, but we have not seen a strong enough commitment from the government to make sure that that money is invested in a way that accomplishes the renewable energy goal. And we've seen too many projects that proposed projects for investment that compromise agricultural land. Agriculture is another major issue we could spend an hour talking about here in Puerto Rico and our food security and agriculture security, but they're compromising agricultural land with some of these really large scale renewable energy projects, what would be called utility scale projects, when again, the research shows that with decentralized or what would be called distributed rooftop solar energy projects, we can really meet most of Puerto Rico's demand. And so we are looking for the government to really, be clear on that and begin spending that money on those type of projects much faster than they currently have been.
Charlotte, for that really comprehensive answer. I really appreciate it. Well, that is all the time we have for questions today. And I just want to let you know that you can find so many resources that can assist you on CDP's website as they relate to Hurricane Fiona. One thing I want to point out right now is that we do have a standing CDP Atlantic Hurricane Season Recovery Fund that will very much be focusing on the long-term recovery needs following Hurricane Fiona. And that fund will address all of the geographic needs from the Dominican Republic to Puerto Rico and other areas that may be affected. Certainly our eyes are very squarely trained on Puerto Rico at the moment. We also have issue insights on our website that provide an introductory look at disasters and responses. We have profiles that give regular information about the impact of a disaster and the needs of the community to inform philanthropy on how they can help. Our Disaster Philanthropy Playbook is now hosted on our main site and provides numerous resources for those planning disaster funding. We also have a monthly newsletter full of information and regular blogs, including our weekly What We're Watching blog that highlights disasters around the world. CDP's staff team is honestly always available to provide guidance, and if you need more in-depth assistance, we also provide a variety of consulting services. You can find more information about our work at disasterphilanthropy.org. We have a webinar coming up on October 13th at 2 p.m. And this webinar will talk about the issue of mobile homes in disaster and understanding risks and opportunities. So I want to extend my sincerest thanks. This is expected. This is expected to be a busy hurricane season. And if this week is any example, the tropics are heating up. Here at CDP, we'll be monitoring the forecast and preparing to assist funders in different communities if they're affected by a storm. I want to thank our co-sponsors and our speakers for taking their time to share their insights with us. Charlotte and Laura, please know that our hearts are with you and all the people affected by Fiona in Guadeloupe, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Bermuda, and Atlanta, Canada. Please, please, please stay safe. We do hope that you'll take a moment to complete our post-webinar survey to let us know what you liked and what you'd like to see in future webinars. It'll pop up automatically when you exit the webinar. And if you have any questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's webinar, you may email them to Tanya at tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. I will say that when we send out our follow-up email to you all, we'll do our best to answer a couple of the quick questions that were in the Q&A that we couldn't get to, including the name of the organization, Bianca, that you asked about, so we'll take care of that. Thank you all so much and have a great afternoon.